Welcome back to MyJewelryBench.com. Today we're going to cover the full restoration of this 18 size Elgin 17 jewel pocket watch. It was sent to me by a subscriber on my YouTube channel, and we have several challenges with this watch. First, you can see it's pretty dirty and pretty rusty. We're going to go through and disassemble, clean out all the debris and rust, and try to get this back to life. It has a lot of issues. We had a broken balance staff, a missing roller jewel, a lot of corrosion and rust, broken mainspring, and missing a crystal, as well as one of the hands was destroyed, and the second hand was the wrong second hand for this particular watch. So we're going to go through and hopefully get the watch to look like this. And here's a list of all the things that we're going to cover in this video. It is a long video, guys. I apologize for that, but we got a lot of work to do. Well, this watch belongs to a gentleman by the name of Nick, and Nick sent me this in for a complete overhaul. It needs a whole lot more than an overhaul, but we're going to take a look at this. You can see there's a ton of corrosion that's just embedded under the dial onto the case, and it took me about 40 minutes to free up that bezel so that I can remove the watch movement. I actually had to take out the balance cock and the balance staff, open up the mainspring barrel while the watch was still in the case, and I put it in the ultrasonic cleaner for about a half an hour before I get that bezel off. That's a little trick that will sometimes work. I did try cooling it off in the refrigerator. I added a little heat to it. I still couldn't get it off. So the ultrasonic cleaner made a little bit quicker work of that. Here you can see I'm removing the case, and it's just, that frame is just atrocious. It's just corroded and dirty, and I'm a little leery at this point while I'm disassembling this watch as to whether or not I'll actually be able to get it repaired. But we got a little lucky. You can see most of the rust on the watch is mostly surface rust and not full-blown corrosion, so we ended up okay on most of the parts. Here I'm just showing you there's a little bit of rust in there, and looks like the cannon pinion, or the safety pinion rather, has been sprung probably when the watch mainspring broke. It sprung out that safety pinion, and I'll explain that to you in a little bit, what the safety pinion is actually for. Now it's time to loosen up the dial, and these dial screws were just covered with dirt and corrosion, so it took me a little effort to get those unscrewed, but it eventually came out. And we can remove the dial once that's done. Believe it or not, Nick's dial is in a fairly good shape. The underside of it wasn't rusted or corroded. There was no damage to the solder on the porcelain subdial. And for the most part, like I said, everything under the watch dial was surface rust. You can see there is a whole lot of corrosion there, unfortunately. We're going to do our best efforts to get that corrosion off and see what we can do. So normally when I'm working with watches that have corrosion or rust damage on them, I'll typically start with a nylon brush, and I'll try to remove as much debris as I can with a nylon brush. That is a non-destructive brush. I had to, in this case, move to a fiberglass strand brush because the nylon just wouldn't get any of the debris and rust off of these parts. So what I wanted to start with was just removing the surface rust off of the parts as best I can while the watch was still assembled. Remember, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this repaired or not because I don't know how extensive the corrosion and rust damage is on this particular watch. The watch was sitting without a crystal, and the debris and dirt must have gotten into the watch movement from there, and I imagine that moisture and humidity, depending on how this was stored, caused a lot of the rust on this watch. So the corrosion amount that's on this particular watch is more of an indication to me that there was a whole lot of moisture, maybe even standing water, that was sitting on this for a long period of time. And luckily it didn't do any damage to the dial, but you can see it did cause quite a bit of damage to the watch frame itself. So right here you can see I'm kind of using the fiberglass brush and going around the perimeter of the frame of the watch, and I'm just trying to remove as much debris and dirt and some of the light corrosion off of this as much as possible. Also to clean off those dial screws because those will have to come out to get cleaned up. So once I get that done, I'm just going to start tackling the rest of it, and any surface rust I see, I'm going to start tackling with the fiberglass brush. Now the brushes, I'll put a link to those in the description below as well on my website. You can get those. I get them on Amazon. They're pretty cheap there. Watch suppliers tend to charge a whole lot of money for these, and you don't necessarily have to spend that kind of money. But we're just going to continue just removing as much debris as possible. Are some brass brushes and steel brushes that you can get. I don't recommend those on a watch movement. Please don't use brass brushes or steel brushes on a watch movement. You're going to do more damage than you are actually going to clean it up. Fiberglass is still the best way, but do this before you clean. Once I get as much of that surface debris off, I can start removing the plates. This is a full plate movement, so I'm going to remove the 3 screws that hold that plate down. This will expose the train system underneath, and I can start removing those one by one and examining each of the gears as I take them off. Now, every time you open up a watch, you never know what you're going to find in it, and here I'm just going to take a look at what's going on underneath the full plate, and you can see we've got some rust that's kind of just dried up into the jewels, and luckily it hasn't really destroyed any of the pinions on the gears. This particular gear, the escape wheel, was actually almost seized in place with the amount of debris that was stuck in the jewels. So be careful when removing that, because you don't want to replace it, although these parts can easily be found. So I'm going to take out each gear and I'm going to examine it one by one, and I'm going to do the best I can to use the fiberglass brush and start removing any debris and rust from within the teeth and the crevices of each gear. I'm also going to examine each of the outer gears. And I know you guys are probably complaining and cringing because I'm not wearing gloves. But remember, at this point, I don't even know if I can even fix this watch. We don't know how much corrosion is on each of these gears or pinions. So I'm really just spending some time doing a pre-examination and seeing how much I can get out of the watch, how much debris I can get out of the watch before I actually make a commitment to go ahead and do a full service on this. Here's the hour wheel. Again, we had some standing moisture in there that must have done some surface corrosion to the gear. Luckily, it's only surface damage, so we could get that off with the fiberglass brush. And I'm just going to start removing any debris, rust, and corrosion that comes off with the fiberglass brush before I take out each part. Just makes my life a little easier, and I'm not working with something that's totally dirty. I can actually see what I'm going to work on with the microscope as I take each part off. Let's grab that cannon pinion, pull it off, and you can see there's some significant rust on the plate underneath it, but it's not corrosive. It's just mostly some surface damage. And here I'm going to use the fiberglass brush to just wipe out all the rust that's on this particular piece. And so far, so good. I'm able to get all the rust off. There is a little bit of pitting, so we can polish each of these gears up if we need to. I don't know what's coming up next, though, because we don't know how much damage there is on the watch. Again, I'm just going to start brushing off before I tackle the next gear. And we're just going to blow it off with the hand blower. Just make sure that everything is in good shape before we tackle on. Now, this is the main wheel, or the main gear, first gear, or whatever you like to call it, and it was pretty corroded. And I think because it's exposed, the cannon pinions on top of it, there was a lot of rust, surface rust on the hour wheel and the cannon pinion. It just trickled into the main wheel. So I'm just going to try to get as much off with the fiberglass brush as possible. Here's the safety pinion. You can see I'm turning it because it let loose when the mainspring broke, and that is the purpose of a safety pinion. That is threaded on in reverse so that if the spring breaks and the barrel spins, instead of damaging the first wheel or chewing up some of the gears, that will unscrew itself and spin and save the first wheel as well as the gearing and the barrel for the mainspring. And I'm just going to pull that off. We're going to put that aside, see what's underneath it. And here again, you see we have to tackle it with the fiberglass brush and get that out. You can shorten and lengthen the distance of the fibers that come out of the brush. You just turn it like you would turn like a ballpoint pen. It's going to leave a lot of fibrous debris on your parts. Again, I'm doing this before I make the determination as to whether or not I'm going to go in and service this watch, just to see how much damage is done. So just going to tackle it. I don't really care how much debris is on there from the fiberglass pen, because we're going to degrease these and clean them before we assemble it if we choose to go ahead and do the repair. And Nick has to approve the repair before I go ahead and do it, so I'm doing this before I call Nick because I don't want him to just get an outrageous bill for all this time without his approval. So I'm tackling that set gear. You can see the damage to that is mostly surface staining, thank God. I was able to get the surface rust out, and I used a little bit of 5000 grit emery cloth on that just to tackle some of the staining, but the staining is embedded into the steel parts. And I'm taking a look at the jewels. You can see there's a lot of debris stuck in the jewels. That's pretty hard and encrusted. We'll tackle that later. And I'm going to go back to cleaning out the gears. This is the second gear or second wheel. A lot of surface rust on this particular piece. Thank God it wasn't damaged more than that. So we're just going to use the fiberglass brush again and continue removing the debris. You guys are getting bored with me cleaning all these parts, but I did want to show you what you're going to find. If you do find a watch that's been sitting around without a crystal on it, or maybe a cover that was removed, you're going to find debris like this, especially if it's been sitting for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So get used to it. You're going to have to clean and polish these parts up as best you can. And again, I'm still working on this, trying to figure out if this watch is salvageable. Most of the staining and rust damage, again, is surface so far. I did find a few parts that were pitted, but for the most part, we can polish those up maybe, and I won't know until I give it a shot. And again, make sure that you get into all the nooks and crannies before you start taking these parts apart, just to make sure that they're going to come apart easily and that they move freely enough to be removed. And here you can see I'm going to remove the clutch system. This is going to be where the stem attaches to the watch movement from within the case frame, and luckily there wasn't too much damage here or debris. I was surprised. Normally these screws would be damaged to the point where I'd have to pre-oil them to get them out, but I got a little lucky here. And as you can see, once I removed that from the watch, we did find some surface rust. There's a little pitting on this gear, but I think for the most part, so far what I'm seeing under the microscope is that it's salvageable. We're going to keep trying to get some of that debris off. I'm going to pull this apart and see what's on the inside of this. And you can see there was some surface rust on the inside. This does have to be cleaned off and polished if you are going to go ahead and reuse this part, because it needs to work smoothly within the watch. So every time I remove a part from this watch, it seems like I'm finding more surface rust, and I'm a little leery about the corrosion that I see once in a while, but I'm just going to keep tackling this and removing it. And if you find a watch like this, or you buy or get a watch that's been sitting around for a long time, take your time. Pull it apart very slowly. Make sure that it's not stuck or corroded before you go removing the parts. Do a surface cleaning, because you might find something broken or damaged beyond repair as you're working with these parts. So just take your time and examine them as you're disassembling and cleaning them. If I found several broken parts or parts that were corroded beyond repair, I'd have to look at the cost of replacing those parts or making those parts. And if I found things that were just impossible to get or too expensive to replace, we'd probably call it quits. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with each step of cleaning off each of these parts. I'm just going to run through this real quick. I took the decision, or made the decision, to go ahead and just fully disassemble this watch and look at every single part before I called Nick back and let him know whether or not I wanted to determine whether this watch could be fixed or not. That's a big important piece of doing an estimate. You want to make sure that every single part's been examined, and that whether or not you can replace it, repair it, whatever, you want to have that covered before you call your customer back, or before you make the decision to go ahead and go service the watch. Now here you can see I'm taking some 3000 and 5000 grit sandpaper or emery cloth, and I was just trying to get some of that corrosion off. It's really embedded into the nickel part of the movement, and even polishing it could destroy the movement. So I took the decision that I would only take it down to the metal, leaving some of the corrosion, because it's underneath the dial, you're not going to see it. Here I'm just going to tackle the mainspring barrel. The mainspring had shattered, so there were about 12 or 13 pieces in there, and we're just checking out every single piece here. The arbor barrel for the mainspring, the barrel itself, the cap. I'm just looking for any surface rust, and you can see where there's some screws that were on there. There was some debris, light rust on there. We cleaned every screw on this also, just to make sure I didn't have to replace any. Now this watch does have a broken balance staff, so we're going to have to disassemble that completely to get the balance staff off of the balance wheel, before we place it. And I'm just examining everything else to make sure that the watch is salvageable here. If anything on the balance is damaged beyond repair, then we're going to look at replacing it, and that's a big expense. So here you can see I've got all the dirty parts sorted in a parts tray. I've got a clean parts tray that's ready to go, and what I'm going to do now is clean each of these parts individually. Again, I'm going to examine them under the microscope, sort them out, and put them in the clean tray. I've already talked to the customer. He's said to go ahead and do the service work on the watch, so we're going to start the reassembly and service of each of the parts on the watch. So I've determined that the first part I'm going to work on is the balance staff, and to do that I have to remove the balance from the balance cock. We're going to loosen up that screw and pull off the balance wheel from the balance cock and put that aside. This part will have to be serviced and cleaned again. And I'm going to examine it, and there you can see we've got a good pinion on the lower side of the balance staff, and I've got a missing roller jewel. I didn't notice that before, but we're going to have to address that. And of course, the upper pinion on the balance staff is gone. It's broken off. This could have been dropped, could have broken the crystal, broken a couple parts inside, and that's why it's sat forever getting corrosion in it. Now this hairspring does have some surface rust on it. I'm going to use a little bit of rust converter on it. I'm going to clean it real well, see if we can salvage it. If not, we can replace it. The next thing I have to do is get the roller table off. That round disc that's attached to the balance staff is a roller table, and it has a roller jewel typically stuck out of one side of it, and that's what articulates with the pallet fork, causing that ticking that you hear from a mechanical watch. So we have to get that roller table off, and this is a roller table remover that you put into a staking set, and then we use a balance or a stake that has a small little hole to push down on the balance staff and pop off the roller table. So if you do this correctly, I'm going to give this a little couple tips with a nylon hammer or a brass hammer or whatever you choose, and that roller table should loosen up or pop off. In this case, I'm just going to tap it, and it loosened up and enough to pull it off by hand. Once that's done, I'm going to take this out of the tool. I'm going to just kind of loosen it up with a pair of parallel pliers, and now I'm going to examine the balance wheel and just make sure everything's fine on it. This also has a little bit of surface rust on it. What I'm doing here is just making sure that I can squeeze this into the right staking hole, use that same stake tool to pop off the balance staff from the balance wheel. So again, we're going to tap it until it pops off the frame of the balance wheel. And there it goes. I can lift the balance wheel off of the staff, and then we can remove the staff from our staking set. There it is. And now I'll find a new staff and match it up with the correct Elgin size. So I'm lucky enough to have, over the last 25 years, purchased estates from watchmakers, and I've gotten literally thousands of balance staffs for American watches and wristwatches. So I'm going to match up the staff that meets this particular watch's model, and we are going to install it. So here you can see what I'm doing is I'm using my staking set, and I'm just putting in the staff the appropriate way, and I'm just trying to find the right size hole that'll hold this in place while we attach the balance wheel to that balance staff. Here I'm going to put that on there, and I'm going to use a balanced hole stake or a tapered hole stake, which it will go around the balance staff nice and tight, and we can tap it down with a brass hammer or a rubber hammer and just kind of put a little pressure on there to allow the staff to seat tightly onto the balance wheel. You're not going to apply a lot of pressure, just enough to kind of pressure fit it in there so that it won't come out. You don't want to deform the balance wheel at this point. This balance wheel has enough issues already, so what I want to do next is actually test this. So once I've determined that the balance staff is seated correctly onto the balance wheel, I'll go to the next step, which is actually to test the balance wheel. And testing the balance wheel is pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to put it onto the upper frame or upper bridge of the movement, in this particular case. And I'm going to seat the balance cock on top of the frame and just make sure that the balance staff is seated correctly in the two jewels. and then I'll screw it down and make any adjustments I have to make, and then give it a test with my hand blower just to see how freely it spins. You can see the balance wheel is a little bit out of true, and I will use a balance caliper to adjust that. That'll be for a different video, but we're going to adjust the rotation of that, also the weights, and make sure that it's perfectly round. And I'm just going to test this in the upright and reverse positions just to make sure it spins freely without any encumbered friction. Well, like I said, this is missing the roller jewel, and I have to replace it. I didn't notice this prior to calling the customer, but we're just going to go ahead and do this anyway. Here's my little vial of roller jewels. These are mixed. Normally they would be separated by size. I have that from an estate sale I purchased. There's my roller jewel setting tool, and you'll use this to attach the jewel and the shellac, and a little vial of shellac in the background. You can see that's probably a lifetime supply. Here's a candle that I'm going to use. I'm going to light the candle and heat up the roller tool to melt the shellac in place and seat the jewel. And when you follow these instructions along, the first time you do it, it's pretty tough. The second time you do it, a little easier. And I've done hundreds of these, so you just get used to doing them. What you're going to do is take that roller table, and you're going to insert it into the tool, just like so. And we're going to leave that perimeter hole outward. Now, sometimes on a roller table, those holes are round where the jewel attaches, and sometimes they're keyed in a half moon. So this particular one, Elgin, Waltham, Hamilton, usually have keyed jewels, and those are important to align correctly because you can't get them in the hole if you don't have the right size. And we're going to select a jewel. We're going to heat up the tool using the candle. This takes about 5 minutes, so patience is important. The first thing I have to do is remove the broken pieces of jewel and the shellac off of the old roller table. So we're going to heat that up. Like I said, it takes about 5 minutes to heat it up enough so that the roller table can be cleaned off. So use your patience and just do this step by step. And the wax in this candle is in the way, so I may grab a new candle. I think I did, but just in case, we're going to follow along here. And here you can see I had to get a new candle because my other candle was just too burnt down and it wasn't getting the roller tool hot enough. So a new candle will always help, or a bigger candle if you have it. And again, just take your time. It takes a little time to heat up the roller tool, to apply enough heat to the roller table so that you can poke out that broken bit of jewel and the excess shellac that's been on there for, who knows, maybe 100, 120 years. And once it's heated enough, you can see I can poke through that a little bit better. I'm just going to heat this up a little bit more. The shellac has gotten warm enough where it's soft. I can push through that hole, and you'll see me now just poke through it, and the little bits of shellac and jewel will come right out. Again, be patient, take your time. And there it is. Comes out, and we can clean it off. I'm just going to heat it up a little bit more so that it's a little easier to clean off. And now I've got a nice clean roller table, and it is ready to seat the new shellac on the top side of the roller table. So I'll grab a new piece of shellac. This piece is already hot, so you can see that the shellac is melting enough. So the trick is here, just get that shellac over the hole. And to move the soft shellac around, I like to use something metal. Here I'm using my oiler. It's not going to hurt the oiler at all. And I'm just going to make sure that that shellac melts into the hole. You want the that shellac to get into the hole a little bit enough so that when you put the jewel in from the opposite side, it's going to hold it in place. The next step is just make sure that you have the right size jewel for the roller table that you're working with. I did have to pick through these a little bit because they're not sorted. Maybe that's one thing I can do when I have some time in the future. Once you get that jewel in, there it is, it's seated. I did not film that. This is worse than needling a thread, so you're going to have to take your time. I suggest you use 2 or 3x magnification on a visor, and you can see that there's enough shellac on there to hold it. The next thing is to clean off any excess shellac that might be in the way of our movement. So you don't want that in that little indent at the top side or the front side of that roller table, because that needs to swing freely as it oscillates with the pallet fork. Once that's done, we can go on to the next step, which is assembling the roller table back onto the balance staff. Now, you're going to do this in the reverse that you took it off. And it's not that hard. We're going to use our staking set with some extra tools that come with your staking set, hopefully. And we're going to put the balance wheel upside down onto our staking set in one of the holders. And I'm going to take the roller table with the roller jewel installed, and I'm going to set that on the balance staff. This is a pressure fit part, so you're going to use a new stake that's made specifically for roller tables. It has a hole on it, as well as a notch where the jewel protrudes from the roller table. And you're going to put that in your staking set and line it up so that you're not touching the jewel there. And here you can see the stake that I'm going to use. I just banged into it, which is always a bad thing. We're going to line that back up. And I typically like to have my roller table aimed a specific way. Now here, it's not quite aimed. I've got it following the frame of the balance wheel, and it's a little off, so I may make an adjustment here, I believe I did, to aim it towards that outer perimeter screw on the balance wheel so that I knew exactly which way it was pointing when I go to set this and align it up with the hairspring. So here you can see I'm just using a pair of tweezers. I'm going to align that roller table straight down the inner frame of the balance wheel, and now I'll use that stake, that roller stake, to tap this down with a, again, you're going to use a rubber mallet or a brass hammer and just tap that down until it's seated correctly onto the balance staff. And you'll hear it ticking, or you'll hear the tap just a little bit different. So here we're just going to check it and make sure that everything is straight and organized, and there's our roller table installed onto the balance staff. So here you can see I'm just putting a mark on the balance wheel, and that allows me to see where the roller jewel is aimed from the balance staff out to the outer perimeter. And the next step is to add the hairspring onto the balance staff. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put the hairspring in place. I'm going to use a round stake with a hole in it and just kind of push that down a little bit so it's tight. I'm going to pull out my staking set, and I'm going to use a roller holder, a roller table holder for my staking set. That is reverse of the stake that we used to tap down the roller table. You can see it has a hole in it and a notch where the roller jewel will fit onto. And if you look closely, you can see how I'm just going to line that up and drop it onto that stake. Okay, so from there, just going to take a look at this, and you can see the jewel in the notch. Just doing this so that you guys can see it. And now the next thing is to push down by hand using that open hole stake. I'm just going to push this down and place it onto the balance staff. Now the one thing is we need to align the hairspring with the rotation and placement of the balance. So to do that, we're going to put the balance cock back onto the movement, and I'm going to line it up. So let me explain how I align these up. Aligning your balance and your hairspring is very important for the bead accuracy of your watch. So here's the roller position underneath the balance wheel. So that's the position of the roller jewel. And you can see it needs to be in a straight line from the center of the balance out to the escapement gear, so that each of the gears, pinions, are in a straight line and it lines up. Here's the outer collet of our hairspring. Now this outer collet has to be moved so that it fits into the hole on the balance cock where that little screw is, so that we can tighten and align it. And there you can see that's the little hole in the balance cock where that outer collet for the hairspring attaches. So we need to align that by turning it counterclockwise in this example. So to do that, I'll take a small jeweler's screwdriver and I'll put it in that little center notch on the center collet of our hairspring, and I will turn that counterclockwise until the outer collet meets the position of the balance cock's hole, or the receiver for it. So what it looks like in reality, or in real life, this is how I would do it. I would take the small screwdriver. I'm going to put it in that little notch on the center collet, and I'm just going to apply a little pressure to turn that counterclockwise, very, very gently. This does not move easily, but it's not really hard on that. And once I've got that done, I can go back and try to realign the position to make sure that I'm in the correct position. And if I have to make any more adjustments, I can continue to do those by making small little turns ever so slightly to align that up. And now the next step is to put the hairspring, balance, everything back together onto the balance cock. So I'm going to loosen up that screw that holds the outer collet of our hairspring in place. And we are going to put the balance wheel with the hairspring on it and screw it down onto the frame or the balance cock. Now this is not that hard to do. Just take your time, do it right, don't cause any damage, and align it all up correctly. And once your balance wheel is seated properly onto the balance cock, you can go ahead and tighten up that screw. This can be a little tricky to do. I'm trying to do it with tweezers instead of my fingers because I want to get this in view of the camera. Normally I would hold this with my hand, a gloved hand of course, and I would tighten that screw up. Once that's tightened down, the next thing I'm going to do is put it back onto the watch plate, and I'm going to give this another test, and just to make sure that it oscillates freely back and forth with no hindrance and no friction. So I'll place that in place. Normally I would put the screw on there and then I would give it a little turn, and again we're just checking it to make sure that it's in good shape. It's not screwed down, so it's kind of wobbling back and forth, but you get the hint. We're progressing along really well with Nick's watch, and the next step is to replace the mainspring. His mainspring had been broken for many years probably. It looks like it had shattered into about a dozen pieces, so a new mainspring is important to put on the watch because that's the only way it's going to work. I'm going to wind this up. I didn't get this in view. It's a little hard to wind a mainspring, trying to film that anyway is a little difficult, but you can see here I'm just kind of winding it in place, and once that's ready, we can put it in the barrel and line it up. This is a T-bar end, and it does have a hole at the very end of the mainspring with a T-bar just offset, and that T actually falls into two notches, one on the upper side of the barrel and one on the cap of the barrel, and we can line it up just by looking at it. When we see the notches in place, we're ready to seat the mainspring into the barrel permanently. I'm just going to check here and make sure that we're lined up good, and once I see the notches, then I can use a small screwdriver to line it up. And I'm going to snap that into place. I'm using the screwdriver to hold it in place onto the little T-end, and boom, it's in. And that is our installed mainspring. The next part would be to put the barrel arbor in place and then put the cap on it, and I'll usually give it a little bit of oil. I do pre-oil my mainsprings before I wind them, and then I just give them a little extra oil just to make sure that they work good afterwards. Installation of the arbor is pretty simple. It'll only go in one way and lock onto the mainspring. So just make sure you've got it lined up correctly, and you should be able to snap that into place. If it gives you a little trouble, just get your hands in there and work on it a little bit, and you can kind of push that into place. You may have to make some adjustments to a mainspring every now and then because older mainsprings are not available and newer ones don't always have the correct coil. I'm just going to give this a little bit of oil, and then we can go on to snapping on the cover. The cover fits in one position. There's that little square notch that lines up to the T-bar end of the mainspring, and then you're going to snap that into place. And here I'm just kind of twisting that cap around until it lines up. If you look closely, you can see the T-end, and I'll snap it in with my fingers. Normally, these will just pop together with your fingers, having enough pressure, but if you need to use a pair of polished parallel pliers, go ahead and do that. Well, let's go ahead and start assembling this watch. Now then, I'm going to start putting the clutch system back together first, since that was the last part I took off, and we will line that up correctly. Make sure that it's seated, and put the screws in there. There are two screws that hold this clutch arbor in place, and I'm going to seat those and tighten those down. These can be a little finicky. They are small screws. There was a little debris on these screws. Again, every single part got a bath. If I could remove the corrosion, I was able to. Otherwise, I would just polish them off just to make sure that there was no friction involved in any of the gears or the pinions. Now we're going to start the clutch assembly. There's the release up on top, and that's usually on the upper side of the plate, the main plate. We're going to put that in position. I'll grab the clutch lever here, and we'll seat that correctly. There's a little tab on this particular watch that notches into a small little hole. We're going to seat that and then align it up correctly, put the screw in place, and tighten it up. Now there is a little oil that you need to place on the inside of that screw so that the arbor slides without any friction. The next thing is the click. we'll put the click in there, make sure the click spring holds it in place. And now we're off to the setting gears and winding gears. So this is part of the clutch system. We're going to insert that center gear, which is a large gear on the train of the setting system or clutch system. There's a small spring that gets put in place. That spring holds one of the setting gears in position. I'm going to pre-oil these little bits here, these arbors, because I want the oil to hold the gear in place when I put everything above it. Now this little setting gear will sit above that spring, and you can see it bounces up and down. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that plate above it. And as long as everything is seated correctly, we should be able to put the rim on there and then the screw in place. And once that's done, we can go back and adjust the position of the underside pin. And now we'll just put all the gears in position. And I typically start, I've done enough of these watches I've showed you, I start in an upside down manner and then try to align the upper bridge or upper plate of the watch to that particular point. It just makes installing these full plate movements with all the train in position a little easier. Now here I can gently hold the two pieces like a sandwich, and again I'm holding them very, very loosely, and I'm just going to align each of the gears and pinions up to make sure that they align correctly in the jewels. Once that's done and aligned, then you can go ahead and put the screw in on the full plate, and that'll hold everything together so that you can let go of it with your hands. Get one screw started. I typically leave these a little bit loose as I go ahead and test the train to make sure everything's free and clear. So I don't tighten everything down permanently until I've oiled everything and made sure that everything is seated correctly. And if you're new to watch repair, then you just take your time and don't try to force parts together. If they don't want to fit, don't force them. And the last screw of the full plate goes in, and again, I'm not going to tighten it down all the way, just enough to hold the train in place. And I'm going to go ahead and oil each of the oiling points on the watch just to make sure that I've got it oiled so I can do a final test. Once I've done that, I'll go ahead and tighten up the plate screws. And we'll get that ratchet wheel in place. That's for the mainspring winding. And that allows it to articulate with the click. I'll insert the new mainspring with the mainspring barrel, and then I'm going to use my winding tool just to turn that ever so gently, and that allows the barrel to get seated into the ratchet wheel. Once it's seated, I can put the barrel plate on. Two screws should hold this together, common with American Waltham and Elgin watches. Make sure the screws are seated correctly before you tighten them down. And then I'm going to give this a little wind, and then I'm going to test the articulation of the pallet fork. Once I'm happy with the way the watch is working, I can go ahead and install the newly completed balance cock with the balance wheel. Now, after I did all the repairs to this, I did clean and service everything. I ended up replacing the hairspring with a new one, or a new used one that was in better shape. And that's the set gear that articulates with the clutch system to allow setting of the watch. This is the cannon pinion, so we'll put the cannon pinion in place. This sits firmly onto the first wheel, then the hour wheel, and then of course we need a dial washer. Now, the dial washer that was on this watch is pretty much ruined, so we'll put a new one in place and get our dial ready for install by loosening up the screws for the dial. There are 3 screws that hold the dial in place. You're going to line that up so that the second hand pinion pokes through the dial at the second hand position, and then the 3 feet should align that up correctly. Just make sure it's squeezed together and then tighten up your dial feet screws. Those are very small screws, and like I said, I had to take them out to clean them in this particular watch, so just be careful when you do that because you don't want to lose them. Now that the watch is running and it's running pretty well, what we're going to do is clean up the case. The first thing I started to do to try to get off the corrosion on the watch case itself was to use a nylon wheel. That was not sufficient enough to get the corrosion out of there. I ended up going to a wire wheel. Somebody has previously sanded off most of the gold-filled covering on this particular watch. Probably because it had been brassed so much by use over time that they just figured it was better to make it look better by sanding off the gold. That doesn't always make it look better, and it doesn't always allow us to have a nice watch that holds up without oxidation over time. But if you just keep it polished and wipe down with a cotton cloth, you can keep that oxidation at bay. So here you can see I'm using a metal wire wheel, and I'm just going to grind off the corrosion that was holding the bezel in place before that I couldn't get off. And I'm going to take this down as best I can without doing any damage to the threads on the watch. Now, once I've got that done, I can go ahead and polish up all the pieces, and I'm going to polish this mostly by hand, but I am going to use the flex shaft tool or a Dremel. You can use with a polishing wheel and some polish compound, and I'm going to try to remove most of the scratches and sand marks that were on this watch. I couldn't get them all out. Somebody used some heavy sandpaper to kind of scrape off all the gold covering on this. But we did manage to get a lot of the finer scratches off. And I'm going to work on the back cover, and I'll typically rotate it like this and then try to polish it along the top with the Dremel tool or a flex shaft machine, and then I will hand polish these with some hand compound. This is mostly to get off most of the burrs, scratches, and sand marks that were on this particular watch. And if you look closely to the back cover, you might be able to see what looks like to be some 150 grit sandpaper marks. I'm going to lightly polish the brass that is exposed on the winding collet, the stem arbor, and the crown. And I'll just finish the rest of the frame all by hand. And then these are going to go into the ultrasonic cleaner for a bath, and I'll let them sit there for about a half an hour to clean off any polishing compound that's still on there. And once you're done polishing with a machine, I always recommend using a little bit of Simichrome or some other compound that allows you to polish up by hand. You're going to use a little bit of elbow grease, and you're going to just rub until you get most of the fine scratches off. Rubbing by hand is actually a little bit better, and I'll start with using a paper towel, and I usually end up with a small microfiber cloth, and then I'll wipe it down and then into the ultrasonic cleaner. Once I've gotten this as far as I can get it, now it's time to put the crystal in place. And I'm going to use a little bit of UV curing glue to put that crystal in place. And I'll go around the perimeter of the bezel where the crystal sits. And you get about 5 minutes working time with this. Once I seat the crystal in place, then it'll go in a UV curing station for about 5 minutes. And that cures the crystal glue onto the bezel. You can still get it off. It just won't come off easily. Now we'll put the dust ring onto the watch. I've cleaned that as much as possible, but there is still a lot of corrosion that's just eaten away the brass on that. But it's important to have that dust cover in place. We'll put the movement into the case frame and flip that over and put the case screw in. And I have to get another case screw for this because it was missing one of the case screws. With that tightened down, I can go ahead and make sure everything winds properly and sets properly, which is important. I'll throw the back cover on just to keep the movement free of debris. Once the cover is on, we'll go on to replace the second hand that was the wrong hand for this particular watch. I've got some new old stock second hands for Elgin watches, so we'll put one on here. And you can see it's running pretty good. The next thing to do is put the hour hand on, and we're going to use Nick's original hour hand. I'm going to seat that properly. Now we're going to set this to a point where I usually set it to 3 or 9 o'clock, and then I'm going to try to fix Nick's original minute hand. Now this hand actually had a crack in it from, looks like it just cracked somewhere at the center pinion. I was trying to gently push this and straighten it out, and that crack just kept expanding, and I kind of figured this was going to happen. Eventually, the tip breaks off, and I end up with this mess. And it just broke off. So off to the Elgin box of parts where we can find a new minute hand. So we'll put that on to the watch. We'll line it up to the 12 o'clock position, and I'm going to tighten it down onto the cannon pinion and just do a little test to make sure that everything sits well and is tight. So there is the watch, and it's running before we put the bezel on it. Time to go to the UV cleaner or UV cure station and get that crystal and bezel out, put it onto the watch. And yes, that is the original dial for this watch. And I was able to clean out most of the cracks, the hairline fractures in the enamel. And there you can see, as best I can, I polished this watch up. Again, the gold-filled covering is pretty much gone on this. Somebody sanded it off, so we're left with a brass exposure. I would recommend just polishing this up over some time and just keeping it from oxidizing, because brass will oxidize. I'm just going to set this to whatever time it is. I believe it was about 4:07 when I finished this. And from start to finish, this watch took me approximately 12 hours. It's nice to see the watch working so well. I'm going to give it a test for about a week or 10 days and just make sure that it keeps good time, make any adjustments I have to make over that particular time. That's the inside of the cover, and I'm pretty pleased with how this came out. Mechanically, this watch is free from friction debris. There is some corrosion damage on the inside of the plate, but not much I can do. So anytime you can go from this ugly, dirty monstrosity with a lot of dirt, debris, corrosion, to something that looks like this, that is a working watch from probably 125 years ago, that's a nice thing. And this is one of those watches that I even surprised myself with some of the damage in there, only having to replace a couple parts. Guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing. And we'll do weekend watches on Sundays, and 3D Thursdays will be coming soon. Have a great day.